December 2nd, 1945, a freezing rain fell on the British military compound near Lübeck, Germany, as 37-year-old Margaret Hoffmann crept through the darkness toward the mess tent's rear entrance. This wasn't the first time a desperate German civilian had attempted to steal from Allied facilities in the occupied zones. But she was among the few who would be caught in the act, discovered by the very soldiers whose food she was taking. What made her capture different wasn't her desperation or her defeated country's status. It was what she carried in her worn hands and gaunt face, a hunger so deep it had consumed her dignity entirely. Before we discover what happened when this starving woman encountered British mercy, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 37-year-old Margareta Hoffmann moved through the compound shadows with careful, measured movements. Every step was calculated to avoid detection, a skill born from months of surviving by taking what wasn't hers. She had been a schoolteacher in Lübeck before the war had consumed everything she knew. Capture tonight would mean imprisonment, possibly worse. But the alternative, watching her two daughters waste away from starvation, had made the risk irrelevant. Now she stood outside a British mess tent, wearing a threadbare coat that hung loose on her diminished frame. Beside her knowledge of the consequences, 31-year-old Corporal David Henderson stood guard duty, called Dave by everyone in his unit, performing his rounds with the methodical boredom of someone who had done this patrol 1,000 times. Dave had been a factory supervisor in Birmingham before conscription, believing guard duty in occupied Germany would be simple and safe after years of combat. The reality had proven far different from expectations. He had learned that occupation meant watching desperate people do desperate things, that victory looked like desperation, that winning meant standing between starving civilians and food. Sergeant Robert MacLeod, at 42, the oldest in the unit, sat in the guard station with the weary resignation of someone who had survived too much to be surprised by anything. His hands remained steady as he filled out paperwork, not from confidence, but from the emotional detachment that came from witnessing humanity at its worst. He had fought through North Africa and Italy. He had seen what war did to cities, to families, to the basic social contract. Now he expected nothing from this occupation duty except perhaps the minimum required by military regulations. Anything more would be a dangerous complication. Captain Thomas Sterling watched the compound from his office window. He had overseen this facility for 3 months since Germany's surrender, but something about the increasing desperation of local civilians troubled him. The intelligence reports mentioned escalating thefts from military stores, desperate Germans stealing food, clothing, medicine, anything that might help them survive the brutal winter. He noticed how the guard reports had changed. Less about security threats, more about moral dilemmas. These were soldiers trained to fight enemies, now tasked with guarding food from starving people. The distinction troubled them more than they admitted. What none of them knew yet was that their understanding of justice was about to be completely transformed. The punishment they had authority to impose was about to meet a humanity they couldn't have anticipated. And it would begin with something as simple as a woman's trembling hands reaching for a loaf of bread. Margaret had been watching the guard patterns for 3 nights. She knew Corporal Henderson made his rounds every 20 minutes. She knew Sergeant MacLeod rarely left the guard station between midnight and 2 a.m. She knew the mess tent's rear flap had a loose fastening that could be quietly opened. 3 nights of observation, 3 nights of gathering courage, 3 nights of her daughter's hollow eyes asking without words when she would bring food. Tonight was the 4th night. Tonight, she would take the risk. She waited until Henderson passed, counting his footsteps as they faded into the distance. Then she moved quickly to the tent's rear entrance. Her hands trembled as she worked the fastening loose, not from cold, but from the physical toll of prolonged malnutrition, combined with fear. The flap opened silently. She slipped inside. The smell hit her first. Bread. Real bread, fresh and yeasty. Nothing like the sawdust mixture rations that had been Germany's bread for the final war years. Her stomach clenched painfully at the scent. She hadn't eaten real bread in over 2 years. The mess tent was dark except for moonlight filtering through canvas. Long tables stretched in rows. On one table near the entrance sat tomorrow's breakfast preparations. Loaves of bread, containers of butter, tins of jam, a wheel of cheese, more food than Margareta had seen in months, just sitting there, waiting for British soldiers who would eat their fill and probably leave half of it uneaten. She moved toward the table with desperate focus. Her hands reached for a loaf of bread, grasping it like a lifeline. Then another. She stuffed them inside her coat, then cheese, then tins of jam. Her movements became less controlled, more frantic. This was more food than her daughters had eaten in weeks. She could feed them for days, maybe a week if she was careful. "Stop right there!" The voice came from behind her, sharp and unmistakably British. Margaret froze, the blood draining from her face. She turned slowly to see Corporal Henderson standing at the tent entrance, his torch pointed directly at her. His rifle held ready but not aimed. For a moment, neither moved. Henderson stared at the German woman with bread stuffed in her coat and shame written across her face. Margaret stared back with the trapped desperation of an animal that knows it's caught but might still fight. "Please," she said in broken English, the word barely a whisper. "Please, my children." "Hands up," Henderson interrupted, his voice uncertain despite the command. "Step away from the table." Margaret raised her hands slowly, the movement causing a loaf of bread to fall from her coat and thud onto the ground. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent tent. She watched the bread roll across the dirt floor and felt something break inside her. Not just her hope of feeding her children, but something deeper. The last remnant of dignity she'd been clinging to. Henderson called for Sergeant MacLeod, who arrived within minutes. The older sergeant surveyed the scene with an expression that revealed nothing. The German woman with her hands raised, the stolen food scattered around her feet, the desperation that hung in the air like smoke. "Search her," MacLeod ordered. "Document everything she took." Henderson approached Margaret carefully, as if she might be dangerous despite her obvious weakness. He removed items from her coat, 3 loaves of bread, a small wheel of cheese, 4 tins of jam, a package of tea. He laid them on the table methodically while MacLeod wrote down each item in his report book. Margaret stood motionless, tears running down her face, though she seemed unaware she was crying. The simple act of being caught, of having the food taken back, had broken through the emotional numbness that had kept her functioning through months of deprivation. "Name?" MacLeod demanded. "Margaret Hoffman," she replied in heavily accented English. "Address?" She gave an address in Lübeck's destroyed residential district. "Family?" "2 daughters, 7 and 9 years old." Her voice cracked. "Please, they are starving. I am not thief. I am teacher. I am good person. But my children—" "Save it," MacLeod interrupted, though his tone lacked harshness. "You're under arrest for theft of military property. You'll be held pending charges." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Arrested, charges, prison, and her daughters alone, waiting for food that would never come. She began to sob, her body shaking with the force of emotions she'd suppressed for too long. Henderson looked away, uncomfortable with her breakdown. MacLeod maintained his professional demeanour, but something in his eyes suggested the scene affected him more than he wanted to admit. That morning, Margaret sat in a holding cell, a converted storage room with a cot, a bucket, and bars on the single window. She had been given water, but no food, standard procedure for prisoners awaiting processing. Through the window, she could see British soldiers going about their duties, eating breakfast, laughing, living in a world where food was abundant and tomorrow was guaranteed. She thought about her daughters, 7-year-old Anna and 9-year-old Sophie, alone in the ruins of their apartment building, waiting for their mother to return. They would be frightened by now. They would be hungry. Anna would try to comfort Sophie, that's what she always did, but she was too young for such responsibility. Sophie would probably cry, and Anna would hold her, and they would both wonder if their mother was ever coming back. The thought was unbearable. Margaret curled into a ball on the cot and wept with the helpless rage of someone who had done everything possible and still failed. Around midday, the cell door opened. Captain Sterling entered, carrying a folder that presumably contained her arrest report. He was younger than she expected for a captain, perhaps 35, with the kind face of someone who hadn't yet had kindness beaten out of him by war. He sat on the single chair across from the cot and studied her for a long moment before speaking. His German was surprisingly good. "Frau Hoffmann, I've read Sergeant McLeod's report. You were caught stealing food from our mess tent. Under occupation law, this is a serious offence. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak. "The penalty could be up to 6 months' imprisonment," Sterling continued. "In your case, with dependent children, we would need to contact German civilian authorities to arrange care for your daughters while you serve your sentence." The words 6 months echoed in Margaret's mind. 6 months in prison while her daughters starved. They wouldn't survive 6 weeks without her, let alone 6 months. "Please," she finally managed. "Please, sir, I will do anything. I will work. I will clean. I will do whatever you ask, but please do not take me from my children. They have no one else. Their father died in Russia. My parents died in the bombing. There is no one. Please." Sterling's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed something, perhaps sympathy, perhaps just discomfort with her desperation. "Why did you think stealing from a military facility was your only option?" he asked. The question, asked without accusation, opened a floodgate. Margaret began talking, the words spilling out in a mixture of German and broken English. She explained about her husband's death at Stalingrad, about the bombing raids that had destroyed their home and killed her parents, about the final months of the war when food had become scarce, then scarcer, then nearly non-existent, about the collapse after surrender when the infrastructure that had barely sustained them simply stopped functioning, about watching her daughters grow thinner day by day while she searched desperately for work, for food, for any means of keeping them alive. "I tried everything," she said, her voice raw. "I sold everything we owned. My wedding ring, my mother's jewellery, our furniture, everything. I begged at the refugee centres, but there are thousands like me. The lines are too long. The food runs out. I tried to find work, but who hires German civilians now? The occupation forces have their own staff. German businesses have no money to pay workers. I taught school for 15 years, but what use is a teacher when there are no schools?" She paused, wiping her face with shaking hands. "So I watched my children starve. I watched Anna become too weak to play. I watched Sophie stop smiling, and I knew that if I did nothing, they would die. So I decided to steal, because letting my children die was not an option I could accept." Sterling listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, he spoke, still facing away from her. "Frau Hoffmann, what you did was wrong. Theft is theft, regardless of motivation. If I let you go without consequences, word will spread. We'll have hundreds of civilians attempting to steal from our facilities. Order will break down." Margaret's heart sank. She had known this would be his answer, but hearing it spoken aloud made it unbearably real. Then Sterling turned to face her, and his expression had changed. "However," he continued slowly, "I also cannot ignore the reality of your situation. You're a mother trying to feed her children. That's not criminality. That's desperation born from circumstances beyond your control." He paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision. "I'm going to do something irregular, something that might get me reprimanded by command, but I think it's the right thing to do." Margaret looked up, afraid to hope. "I'm going to release you," Sterling said. "No charges, no prison sentence. You'll be free to return to your daughters." The words didn't make sense. Margaret stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. Free? But the theft, the regulations. There will be conditions, Sterling interrupted. First, you will report here tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. You will work in our mess facility, cleaning, food preparation, whatever tasks Sergeant McLeod assigns. You will work 6 days a week. In exchange, you will receive daily rations sufficient for yourself and your 2 daughters. Additionally, your daughters will be permitted to attend the British Army school we're establishing for military dependents. They'll be fed lunch there. Margaret couldn't process what she was hearing. Not punishment, but employment. Not prison, but food for her children. It seemed impossible. A dream she would wake from to find herself still in the cell. Why? She finally whispered. Why would you do this? Sterling sat back down, his expression thoughtful. Because, Frau Hoffmann, the war is over. We won. Germany lost. Those are facts. But facts don't feed children. Facts don't rebuild civilization. If we're going to create a lasting peace, it can't be built on revenge or rigid adherence to regulations. It has to be built on recognizing that the woman who stole bread isn't our enemy. She's just a mother. And mothers everywhere, British or German, would do anything to feed their children. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. Don't thank me. This isn't mercy or kindness. It's practicality. I need workers and you need food. It's an exchange, nothing more. But his tone suggested otherwise. This was mercy, whether he wanted to call it that or not. Margaret walked through the compound gates that afternoon in a daze. She still couldn't quite believe it was real, that she had been caught, arrested, faced imprisonment, and instead been offered employment and food for her children. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. She ran the entire way home, her weakened body protesting the exertion, but urgency overriding exhaustion. When she burst into the cold shell of their apartment, she found Anna and Sophie huddled together under blankets, exactly as she'd pictured them. They looked up with frightened eyes that transformed to relief when they saw her. "Mama!" Anna cried, launching herself into Margaret's arms. Sophie followed, and the 3 of them collapsed into a tight embrace, all of them crying. "I thought you weren't coming back," Sophie sobbed. "I thought the British soldiers took you away forever." "They did take me," Margaret said, pulling back to look at both her daughters. "But then something happened that I don't quite understand. They're letting me work for them, and they're going to give us food, real food, every day." The girls stared at her, as if she was speaking a foreign language. "The British soldiers are giving us food?" Anna asked carefully, as if testing whether she'd understood correctly. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, still half disbelieving it herself. "I start work tomorrow morning, and you 2 will go to school, a real school, with teachers and books and lunch." Sophie's face showed the first hint of something Margaret hadn't seen in months. Hope. The next morning, Margaret reported to the compound at exactly 6 a.m. Sergeant McLeod met her at the gate with an expression that suggested he thought Captain Sterling had lost his mind, but was too professional to say so. "You'll work in the mess facility," he explained in adequate German. "Food preparation, cleaning, serving. You'll work from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., 6 days a week. You'll receive 3 meals daily while here, plus rations to take home. Your daughters will start school next Monday, clear?" "Yes, Sergeant. Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't thank me," McLeod replied gruffly. "Thank Captain Sterling, and don't make him regret this decision." The first day was harder than Margaret expected. The work itself wasn't difficult. She had cooked and cleaned for years, but the psychological weight was crushing. She was working for the enemy, the British soldiers whose bombs had killed her parents, whose forces had killed her husband, whose victory had led to Germany's current devastation. Yet these same soldiers were now feeding her children. She worked alongside 2 other German women, both of whom had been hired under similar circumstances. Frau Weber had been caught stealing medical supplies for her sick mother. Frau Klein had been found scavenging from garbage bins behind the mess tent. Captain Sterling had offered them all the same deal: work for food, redemption for desperation. "He's not like other officers," Frau Weber whispered during a break. "Most of them see us as defeated enemies to be managed. He sees us as people who need help." "But why?" Margaret asked, the question that had haunted her since her release. "Why would he help us?" Frau Klein, older and more cynical, had an answer. "Because it serves him. Happy, fed workers are better than imprisoned thieves. It's practical, not kind." But Margaret had seen Captain Sterling's face, had heard his tone. This wasn't just practicality, this was something more complicated, a recognition that vengeance served no one, that rebuilding required cooperation, that former enemies could extend humanity to each other. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The 3 German women became integrated into the mess facility's operations. Initially, British soldiers had been uncomfortable eating food prepared by German civilians. Some made comments about poison or sabotage. But Captain Sterling addressed these concerns directly in a mess hall meeting. "These women are working for us because we gave them an alternative to starvation," he explained to his assembled troops. "They're not our enemies. They're mothers and wives who got caught in a war they didn't start and couldn't stop. If we're going to rebuild Germany into something better than what it was, we need to start by seeing Germans as individuals, not categories." His words didn't convince everyone. Some soldiers remained suspicious. But most, after seeing the German women work with quiet dignity and obvious gratitude, began to accept their presence. Corporal Henderson, who had caught Margareta stealing, found himself working alongside her frequently. His German was improving and her English was getting better, allowing for basic conversations. One morning, while preparing breakfast, he spoke carefully. "Frau Hoffmann, can I ask you something?" "Yes, Corporal." "That night I caught you. If you had gotten away with it, would you have come back to steal again?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "Yes. I would have stolen every night until I was caught or my children were no longer starving. I would have done anything necessary." Henderson nodded slowly. "I have a daughter back in Birmingham. She's 8. When I saw you that night, I kept thinking about what my wife would do if she were in your situation. If our daughter was starving and she knew where food was, she'd do exactly what you did. She'd steal, she'd lie, she'd do whatever was necessary. That's what mothers do." His words, simple and sincere, seemed to break through something in Margaret. She had carried so much shame about the theft, so much guilt about lowering herself to stealing. But Henderson was right. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother. And mothers everywhere would make the same choice. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for understanding." "I don't know if I understand," Henderson admitted, "but I'm trying to. We all are." 6 weeks after Margaret's arrest and release, Captain Sterling received a letter from headquarters that made his blood run cold. An inspection team was coming to review his facility's operations. The letter specifically mentioned irregularities in civilian employment protocols and unauthorized distribution of military rations. Someone had reported him. Some officer who disagreed with his approach had filed a complaint, and now Sterling would have to defend his decision to employ German thieves instead of imprisoning them. He called Margaret, Frau Weber, and Frau Klein into his office and explained the situation. "There will be inspectors here tomorrow," he said. "They'll ask questions about your employment, about how you came to work here. I need you to tell the truth. Don't embellish. Don't try to protect me. Just tell them exactly what happened." Margaret felt panic rising. "If they dismiss us, if they send us away, then you'll go back to stealing," Sterling interrupted. "And eventually you'll be caught by someone less sympathetic than me, and you'll end up in prison. I know. That's why I need this inspection to go well." The inspection team arrived the next morning, 3 senior officers from divisional headquarters, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else than a freezing compound in occupied Germany. Captain Sterling received them formally, provided documentation of his facility's operations, and answered their initial questions with military precision. Then they asked to interview the German workers. Margareta stood before the three officers in Sterling's office, her hands clasped to stop them from shaking. They questioned her for over an hour, about how she came to work here, about the theft, about Captain Sterling's decision to employ rather than imprison her, about whether she felt coerced or mistreated, about everything. She answered every question honestly, including the hardest one. Frau Hoffmann, do you believe Captain Sterling violated regulations by employing you? Margaret looked directly at the senior officer who had asked. Yes, sir. I believe he did, and I believe he saved my children's lives by doing so. I do not know your regulations. I only know that my daughters were starving, and now they are fed. I was stealing, and now I am working. I had no dignity, and now I have purpose. If that is wrong by your regulations, then perhaps your regulations need to change. The officers dismissed her without comment. She returned to work with a heavy heart, certain she had cost Captain Sterling his career and herself her employment. That evening, Sterling was summoned to meet with the inspection team. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When he emerged, his face was unreadable. The next morning, he gathered all the facility's personnel, British soldiers and German workers alike, in the mess hall. Margaret stood with Frau Weber and Frau Klein, all of them expecting to be dismissed. Sterling stood before them with a paper in his hand. I've received the inspection team's report, he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. They found that my employment of German civilians who had committed theft against military property was indeed irregular and outside standard occupation protocols. Margaret's heart sank. This was it. Dismissal, probably worse. However, Sterling continued, and his expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. They've also recommended that my approach be adopted as a pilot program across the British occupation zone. Apparently, the reduction in theft incidents, the improvement in civilian cooperation, and the cost-effectiveness of employing local workers instead of imprisoning them have impressed Divisional Command. As of next month, facilities throughout the zone will be authorized to employ German civilians under similar terms. The room erupted. British soldiers began talking all at once. German workers looked at each other in shocked disbelief. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of relief so profound she couldn't contain them. Sterling raised his hand for quiet. This means that what we've been doing here, treating former enemies as people capable of redemption, choosing employment over imprisonment, recognizing that desperation drives decent people to desperate acts. This is now official policy. You all made this happen. The soldiers who accepted German workers despite reservations. The German workers who proved themselves trustworthy despite every reason for resentment. All of you created something that Command believes is worth replicating. After the meeting, Margaret approached Sterling privately. She had been practicing words in English for this moment, but when she tried to speak, they wouldn't come. Finally, in German, she said simply, "You saved us. I will never forget this." Sterling replied in his careful German, "Frau Hoffmann, I made a practical decision that happened to align with basic human decency. You saved yourself by having the courage to risk everything for your children and then the grace to accept help from people you had every reason to hate. That's the real story here." But Margaret knew better. The real story was that a British officer had chosen mercy when regulations demanded punishment, had chosen to see potential instead of criminality, had chosen to build bridges instead of reinforcing divisions. That choice, made in a freezing compound in occupied Germany, had changed everything. 15 years after that December night, when she'd been caught stealing bread, Margareta Hoffmann stood in a ceremony hall in Lübeck, watching her daughter Sophie receive her university degree. Anna had graduated 2 years earlier and was now a nurse. Both daughters had thrived, attending the British Army School initially, then German schools as the education system was rebuilt. They had grown up with enough food, with opportunities, with hope. Captain Thomas Sterling, now retired from the military and working with refugee resettlement organisations, had been invited to the ceremony. Margaret had maintained correspondence with him over the years, sending updates on her daughter's progress, thanking him repeatedly for the chance he'd given them. When Sophie crossed the stage to receive her diploma, Margaret saw Sterling wipe his eyes. After the ceremony, he approached their family. "Your daughters are remarkable," he said in now fluent German, but not surprising. They had a remarkable mother. "They had a remarkable chance," Margaret corrected, "given by a remarkable man who chose compassion over regulation." Sterling shook his head. "I've thought about that night many times over the years, about what would have happened if I'd followed protocol. You would have been imprisoned. Your daughters would have been placed in institutional care or worse. The cycle of suffering would have continued. Instead, you worked, your daughters thrived, and the program we started employed over 3,000 German civilians across the occupation zone, all because of one decision to see a person instead of a criminal." Sophie, overhearing the conversation, joined them. Her English was perfect, learned from years of British and American teachers. "Mr. Sterling, my mother told us the story many times about how you caught her stealing but gave her work instead of prison. When I was young, I didn't understand why that was remarkable. Now I study international relations at university. I understand occupation law, repatriation protocols, all of it. And I understand that what you did was extraordinary, not just kind, but revolutionary." Sterling looked uncomfortable with the praise. "It was practical," he insisted. "Nothing more." "It was human," Margaret said firmly. "And in a time when humanity seemed extinct, that made all the difference." Anna, the younger daughter who was now a nurse, shared her own perspective. "I work with refugee families now. Syrians, Afghans, people displaced by current conflicts. And I see the same desperation in their eyes that my mother must have had. The same willingness to do anything, including illegal things, to feed their children. When I tell them my mother's story, when I explain how a British officer chose employment over punishment, I see hope return to their faces. Because your story proves that even in the worst circumstances, there are people who choose compassion. That matters more than you know." Sterling's practical program had indeed expanded across the British occupation zone and eventually influenced Allied occupation policy broadly. By 1948, over 8,000 German civilians were employed by British forces under similar terms. The program reduced theft incidents by 73%, improved civilian cooperation with occupation authorities, and created a foundation for post-war reconciliation that historians would later cite as crucial to Germany's successful reconstruction. But statistics couldn't capture what the program really meant to individuals like Margaret. It meant the difference between her daughters eating or starving, between her having purpose or losing herself to despair, between seeing British soldiers as oppressors or as people capable of mercy. At the graduation reception, Corporal Henderson, now David, as he insisted Margaret call him, attended with his own family. He had remained in contact as well, his initial arrest of Margaret having transformed into an unlikely friendship. His daughter, now 16, met Sophie and Anna and marvelled at how differently their lives could have gone. "My dad told me that he caught your mum stealing," she said, "and that his captain gave her a job instead of prison. He said it taught him that following rules and doing right are sometimes different things." Sophie smiled. "Your father was kind even when he arrested my mother. He called for his sergeant, but he didn't hurt her, didn't treat her roughly. She told us that. She said even in the worst moment, he saw her as a person. That mattered." Margaret's journey from thief to trusted employee to independent businesswoman, she now owned a small restaurant in Lübeck, had become a symbol in the community. When she spoke to young people about the post-war years, she always emphasized the same lesson, that desperation could drive good people to wrong actions, but compassion could transform both the desperate and those who showed mercy. "I stole bread because my children were starving," she would explain. "That was wrong, but I would do it again under the same circumstances." What made the difference wasn't my action, but Captain Sterling's response. He could have punished me according to law. Instead, he chose to understand my situation and offer an alternative. He gave me dignity when I'd lost all of it. He gave me purpose when I had none. He gave my daughters a future when I could see only darkness. She would pause, letting the weight of those words settle. The lesson isn't that stealing is acceptable. It's that mercy is powerful. That seeing people as individuals rather than categories can change everything. That former enemies can become colleagues, even friends. That's how peace is built, not through treaties and policies alone, but through thousands of individual choices to extend compassion instead of punishment. Thomas Sterling's granddaughter asked him once, during a family dinner years later, why he'd risked his career for a German woman who had stolen from his facility. Why he'd violated regulations for someone who was supposed to be his enemy. He set down his fork and considered the question carefully. "Because," he finally said, "the war taught us to see enemies, but peace required that we see people. That woman wasn't German or British or any nationality at all. She was just a mother who was desperate. And if I'd followed regulations and imprisoned her, I would have won according to the rules, but lost according to my conscience. The food she tried to take was worth a few pounds." The choice to show mercy instead of rigidity changed 3 lives directly, hers and her daughter's, and indirectly influenced occupation policy that affected thousands. All because I decided that compassion was more important than compliance. He thought about Margaret's face when he'd told her she was free, when he'd offered her work instead of imprisonment. The disbelief, the overwhelming relief, the tentative hope that maybe, despite everything, the world could still surprise her with kindness. "Remember this," he told his granddaughter. "Rules exist for good reasons, and usually they should be followed. But sometimes, very rarely, there comes a moment when following rules means abandoning your humanity. That German woman stealing bread to feed her children was that moment for me. I could have followed protocol and destroyed 3 lives. Instead, I chose to see a mother who needed help. And that choice, that simple decision to employ rather than imprison, created ripples that are still spreading decades later. All because I decided that mercy was more important than regulations." The story of the German woman who stole from the British mess tent became a case study in post-war reconciliation programs. Military academies used it to discuss the balance between maintaining order and recognizing human needs. Occupation policy analysts cited it as an example of practical compassion, producing better outcomes than rigid punishment. Ethicists debated whether Sterling's decision was truly merciful or simply pragmatic. But for Margaret and her daughters, for the thousands of other German civilians who found employment instead of punishment under the expanded program, and for the British soldiers who learned that former enemies could become colleagues, there was no debate. The choice had been clear then, and remained clear in memory. Compassion, they had learned, was not weakness. Mercy was not naive. Seeing people instead of enemies was not betrayal. It was the hardest kind of wisdom. The wisdom to recognize that humanity transcends nationality, that desperation deserves understanding, and that even in occupation's harsh reality, kindness was possible and necessary. The bread Margaret had tried to steal couldn't have weighed more than 2 pounds. But the weight of Sterling's decision, the impact of that choice to employ rather than imprison, echoed through decades. One woman's desperate theft had become thousands of employment opportunities. One officer's irregular decision had become official policy. And one moment of mercy had taught both victors and vanquished that peace begins not with treaties or surrender, but with individuals choosing compassion when regulations demand punishment. That was the real victory. Not defeating Germany, but remembering, even in occupation's difficult aftermath, how to be human, how to see mothers instead of criminals, desperation instead of malice, people instead of enemies. Captain Sterling had given Margaret work when regulations demanded imprisonment. In return, she and thousands like her had given British forces something equally valuable: proof that reconciliation was possible, that former enemies could cooperate, that the foundation for lasting peace could be built, one act of mercy at a time. The stealing had been wrong. The punishment would have been legal. But the choice to show compassion instead of rigidity had been transformative. For Margaret, who regained dignity and purpose. For her daughters, who grew up fed and educated. For Sterling, who proved that following your conscience sometimes requires breaking rules. And for post-war Germany, where thousands of similar choices created the groundwork for a remarkable transformation from enemy to ally, from devastation to reconstruction, from hatred to understanding. All because one officer decided that a mother stealing bread deserved employment, not imprisonment. That desperation deserved mercy, not punishment. That people mattered more than protocols, that was the lesson. And it remained relevant decades later, in every situation where someone faced the choice between rigid rule-following and human compassion. The bread didn't matter. The regulations didn't matter. What mattered was the choice to see Margareta Hoffmann not as a German thief, but as a desperate mother who deserved a second chance. That choice changed everything.